Good morning, my dear colleagues. Let me share my thoughts about venous thromboembolism that includes deep vein thrombosis and pulmonary embolism, the disease which is often under-recognized and poorly managed. If you look at the magnitude of the problem, in the West, it is supposed to affect 1 out of 1,000 persons per year. Deep vein thrombosis in hospitalized people occurs in a very large number. Nearly 40 to 60% of the people who are admitted for medical and surgical illnesses have pulmonary venous thromboembolism, most of which are subclinical, supposed to be commoner among women and among elderly. Originally, it was believed that the occurrence of deep vein thrombosis or pulmonary embolism was less among Asians. This is no longer true. Even data from Indian studies indicate that it is as common as in the West. Even deep vein thrombosis without pulmonary embolism has a mortality rate of 2 to 5% due to comorbid conditions or bleeding complications out of anticoagulant therapy. And the mortality is glaringly high in pulmonary embolism, as high as 10 to 30%, which is much worse than acute myocardial infarction. The morbid event which is attended with this disease is post-thrombotic syndrome, which is supposed to occur in nearly 1/3 of people. If you look at the risk factors for venous thromboembolism, it could be inherited or it could be acquired. Inherited thrombophilic conditions include mutation of factor V, prothrombin, deficiency of naturally occurring anticoagulant substances like protein S, protein C, antithrombin 3, and elevated homocysteine levels, altered fibrinogen level, as well as the functional capacity of fibrinogen. Acquired conditions include surgery, particularly orthopedic surgery involving the lower limbs, trauma, immobilization due to stroke, long-haul flights, malignancy and chemotherapeutic agents, pregnancy and hormones, heart failure, antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, severe liver disease, renal disease, inflammatory bowel disease, connective tissue disorders, and not to forget heparin-induced thrombocytopenia and recently recognized COVID vaccine-related thrombocytopenia with thrombosis. These conditions could be classified as strong risk factors, moderate risk factors, and weak risk factors based upon the odds ratio of developing this disease. Not surprisingly, the fracture of lower limbs, hip knee replacement, spinal cord injury, heart failure and myocardial infarction, and major trauma comprise the most important strong risk factors which have an odds ratio of more than 10. The conventional Virchow triad explains the mechanism of DVT and pulmonary embolism in the diseases which I have enumerated, namely endothelial dysfunction and damage, hypercoagulability, and stasis. In the presence of these three triad situations, ineffective skeletal muscle pump as a result of prolonged bedridden state and impaired venous valve function could contribute to the formation of thrombus in the veins, which may embolize, leading to pulmonary embolism. 96% of the time, it affects the lower limb veins, 4% in the upper limb. Proximal veins are involved in nearly 88%. Deep vein thrombosis confined to cough occurs in a smaller number, nearly 15 to 20% only. Deep vein thrombosis is the source of pulmonary embolism in almost all those who present with pulmonary embolism. You should remember that 50% of symptomatic proximal deep vein thrombosis will have asymptomatic pulmonary embolism. 70% of pulmonary embolism will have demonstrable asymptomatic deep vein thrombosis. What does it mean? When you encounter somebody with deep vein thrombosis, look for pulmonary embolism. And if you have somebody with who presents with pulmonary embolism, look for deep vein thrombosis. As I mentioned previously, roughly 1/3 of people who present with the DVT end up with post-thrombotic syndrome. This is the way a person with deep vein thrombosis have the future course of events. Majority resolve, nearly 1/3 embolize into the lung circulation, and roughly 1/3 end up with post-thrombotic syndrome. Those with pulmonary embolism, only 6% of them will end up with chronic thromboembolic pulmonary hypertension, and rest, the pulmonary embolism, resolve without any consequences to the right heart hemodynamics. Coming to the diagnosis of the disease, clinically, it can be very easily suspected when somebody presents with short duration, sudden onset, rapid onset, unilateral leg swelling with warmth, pain, and tenderness and erythema. Particularly when the entire leg is swollen like this, consider the possibility of DVT rather than cellulitis. Worst situations, people can develop cyanosis as well as gangrene, which is called as phlegmasia cerula dos. D-dimer is the biomarker to diagnose deep vein thrombosis. Anything more than 500 nanogram per ml is supposed to indicate elevated D-dimer level. For those beyond the age of 50 years, it is better to use age-adjusted upper limit, which is obtained simply by multiplying the age. A patient of 60 years, 600 nanogram will be the upper limit. But the problem with the D-dimer level is it is elevated in many acute medical and surgical conditions like arterial thromboembolism, myocardial infarction, stroke, acute limb ischemia, inflammatory diseases like sepsis, COVID-19, hepatorenal diseases, surgery and trauma, malignancy, thrombolytic therapy, even physiological situations like pregnancy can elevate D-dimer level. This is to say that a negative D-dimer carries more weightage to exclude the disease rather than a positive or elevated D-dimer level. The imaging test for diagnosis of deep vein thrombosis is the Doppler scanning of the lower limb veins. One can demonstrate the thrombus filling up the vein. The veins get distended. Veins cannot get compressed by pressure from the probe, and color Doppler may demonstrate lack of flow or disturbed flow in the thrombosed vessel. You can do Valsalva maneuver and demonstrate lack of increase in vein size if veins are filled up with the thrombus. And calf muscle compression is supposed to augment the flow in the proximal veins. If the proximal veins contain thrombus, the augmentation does not happen. These are the ways to diagnose deep vein thrombosis with the help of ultrasound and Doppler facility. It is having a very high sensitivity, 94% for proximal disease, which is obviously poor for distal vein thrombosis, particularly the calf vein thrombosis. Specificity is as high as 94%. There are certain issues with the venous ultrasound. Isolated iliac vein thrombosis, which occurs in a very small proportion of people, less than 1%. But this is supposed to be commoner in people with pregnancy, pelvic surgery, and malignancy. The diagnosis is not very straightforward with the venous ultrasound. Similarly, difficulties can be encountered to differentiate between acute and chronic venous thromboembolism. Venous distension and hypoechoic thrombus material indicates acute onset, while hyperechoic thrombus, thickened wall, presence of collaterals, etc., may indicate a chronic disease. Whenever we tend to seek the help of investigations, we need to look at the pre-test probability for deep vein thrombosis. Wells probability score is a well accepted one, Each one of the parameters, namely the malignancy, paralysis, lying down in the bed for more than 3 days, major surgery within the last 4 weeks, tenderness, swelling of the leg, pitting edema, collateral superficial veins, carry 1 score each, while when alternative diagnosis is more likely, it carries -2 score. Add everything together and you get the number with which you say it is high probable or moderately probable or low probability for deep vein thrombosis. Once you have the well scored, your algorithm goes like this. If the pre-test probability tells you that it is a low probability situation, go for D-dimer estimation. If it is normal, we can safely rule out deep vein thrombosis. If it is elevated, you need to go for proximal leg vein Doppler test. If it is moderate to high probability situation, you can directly go for the imaging test. If it is positive, treat as DVT. If it is negative, then go for D-dimer. If it is normal, you can exclude it. And if it is positive, you need to repeat the ultrasound after 3 to 7 days. And if it is positive, treat it as DVT. And if it is negative, even after 1 week, you can safely exclude the diagnosis of DVT. As I mentioned, roughly 20 to 25% of people with DVT or pulmonary embolism have inherited thrombophilias. Do we need to test for thrombophilia in all? Certainly not. People who have recurrent venous thromboembolism, unprovoked venous thrombosis, family history of venous thromboembolism, people who have combined arterial and venous thrombosis, people who have had history of fetal loss need to undergo testing. But there are many pitfalls. The normal ranges are very wide. Sometimes you may have to repeat the testing to confirm the thrombophilia. Pregnancy itself may mimic factor V mutation because of resistance to activated protein C. Pregnancy and oral contraceptive pill may lower protein S level. Antithrombin 3 level is decreased in acute thrombosis after heparin administration and preeclampsia. Protein C and S are reduced by warfarin therapy. So obviously, if you need to do blood sampling to confirm thrombophilia, it has to be done before we give any anticoagulant to people with suspected deep vein thrombosis or pulmonary embolism. To discuss about something which is important for the audience, namely DVT in pregnancy, it's a procoagulant state because of increased factors, coagulate factors 7, 8, 10, fibrinogen, and PAI1, and decreased protein S level. It's a procoagulant state. There are many risk factors which go with pregnancy, namely hyperemesis, multipara, multiple pregnancy, family history of venous thromboembolism, age more than 35, obesity, assisted reproductive techniques, preeclampsia, cesarean section, postpartum hemorrhage, abruptio placentae, transfusion, immobilization. All of them are likely to enhance the procoagulant state of pregnancy and make them more prone for DVT. Wells scoring is not well tried out in pregnancy, but there is a simple scoring known as left score. L stands for left leg symptoms because of more common occurrence in the left leg, edema being unilateral, and first trimester. Each one carries 1 score. If it is 0 or 1, the likelihood is less. If it is 2 or 3, the likelihood is more, based on which you can go for D-dimer testing and imaging. You need to assess the risk of recurrence, particularly when you are trying to stop the therapy at the end of 3 to 6 months. You have certain protocols again, what is known as HER2 rule, hyperpigmentation, edema, redness. Any one will carry 1 point. D-dimer more than 250 or 500 at the end of anticoagulation therapy, obesity, and older age. If the score is 2 or more, you need to consider long-term anticoagulation. What is the relationship of PCOS with the DVT, higher occurrence because of obesity, administration of oral contraceptive pills among them. Prothrombotic milieu exists in people with PCOS, and insulin resistance is another one which favors DVT. Studies have confirmed that PCOS has increased chances for developing DVT and pulmonary embolism, the odds ratio being ranging from 1.7 to 1.9 in different studies. Coming to the much feared complication of DVT, namely pulmonary embolism, the clinical presentation, high risk, intermediate risk, or low risk, depends upon the underlying cardiorespiratory status or the diseases and the magnitude of the pulmonary embolism. In addition to the thrombus load, the chemical mediators which are released by the thrombus and coexistent inflammation would cause vasoconstriction, bronchoconstriction, ischemia would lower the surfactant leading to atelectasis, all of which will lead to, worsening of hypoxia. And acute RV overload will result in cardiogenic shock, both of which could, result in higher mortality. You have something like the Wells score for DVT. We have revised Geneva prediction rule for pulmonary embolism. You need to apply that and assess the likelihood of pulmonary embolism who presents with, dyspnea with or without DVT. Though electrocardiogram and chest X-ray had been extensively used to diagnose pulmonary embolism, the parameters are insensitive and non-specific. They are more often useful to exclude simulating conditions like myocardial infarction, heart failure, and pneumonia. Echocardiogram to a certain extent by demonstrating RV overload, McConnell's sign, that is, contraction is well preserved in the apex while the free wall is not contracting. It is supposed to be one of the important pointers for pulmonary embolism, though not 100% specific for pulmonary embolism. Demonstration of tricuspid regurgitation. You can also demonstrate thrombus in the right ventricle, thrombus in transit. Sometimes IVC may show the thrombus material. But the test for confirming pulmonary embolism is CT pulmonary angiography. Except subsegmental pulmonary emboli, all the other situations can be very confidently diagnosed by CT pulmonary angiogram. With the widespread availability of CT pulmonary angiogram, the role of ventilation perfusion scan is coming down. You should remember that as high as 30 to 40% of them, the result is very inconclusive. This is the reason for many of us choosing CT pulmonary angiogram as the gold standard for diagnosis of pulmonary embolism. But there are certain situations like pregnancy, people with renal disease where you cannot use iodine contrast. VQ scan may still be useful for diagnosis of pulmonary embolism. Based upon the hemodynamic stability, the severity of pulmonary embolism, the presence of right ventricular dysfunction on echo or CT scan, and elevated biomarker, namely troponin, people with pulmonary embolism can be classified into high, intermediate risk, and low risk, based upon which the therapy is going to be decided. About the therapy, my colleague will be talking to you. To sum up, DVT and pulmonary embolism is relatively a common disease. If not treated early, if not recognized early, the mortality is quite high. The diagnosis should not be based upon only the laboratory studies. It should be based upon some clinical prediction algorithm, based upon which you need to choose the appropriate biomarker, whether it is a biochemical biomarker or imaging biomarker. You need to exploit them properly and come to conclusion. Thanks for listening.